Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections along with the daily mains answer writing program. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to the impetus being given by the government for the indigenous development of semiconductor technology and manufacturing base. Then in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the inadequate representation of women in the higher judiciary and the need for more women in the same. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a discussion with respect to 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is shaping the future chip by chip. As steel formed the backbone of the modern industrial progress, which primarily depended upon the infrastructure development in the form of roads, highways, railways, power lines. Similarly, semiconductors form the base of the modern digital economy. From the watch you wear to the smartphones which you use excessively, everything contains semiconductors. Semiconductors are actually omnipresent. If there were no semiconductors, there would not be modern lines of communication, no artificial intelligence, no electric vehicles, no renewable energy, etc. This signifies the criticality or the importance of semiconductors. Now, what you have to understand is that the production basis or the manufacturing basis of semiconductors around the world, they have a concentrated origin. That is, there are only specific locations around the world where you find the manufacturing capacity with respect to the semiconductors. That's the first part. The second part which you have to understand is that almost every sector of the modern economy, be it e-commerce, the technological development, the AI, everything is dependent upon the semiconductors. So there is a mismatch. Therefore, it becomes indispensable for any country, and especially like India, to have our own indigenous base with respect to the technological development and manufacturing capacity of the semiconductors. It is in that line that in the year 2021, the government came up with the India Semiconductor Mission, saying that we are going to invest or provide an incentive to the tune of almost 76,000 crores. And India definitely has made progress with respect to that. We have this particular column written by the Union Minister for Electronics and Information Technology, Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, who basically talks about the recently held Semicon India conference, which saw the participation of more than 500 industry leaders with respect to the semiconductors. Now, definitely it's a bright spot. We are investing heavily with respect to the human resources, the technological base for the creation or the manufacturing of the semiconductor facilities in the country. But there are some serious challenges which we'll have to look into. So what we'll do today is that we'll see what a semiconductor is, what is the importance of semiconductor, what are the opportunities for India, what are our strengths and weaknesses, and what should be the way forward. As always, it is going to be a very comprehensive discussion, and believe me, this is one of the most probable topics for the UPSC mains examination. So please pay attention. And again, you have to understand is what the minister says, that right now, as of 2024, the valuation, the global industry valuation with respect to the semiconductor, it stands to almost $630 billion. And it is projected to basically cross $1 trillion by the end of this particular decade. And what the minister is saying is that India is poised to emerge as a competitive hub for the entire value chain with respect to the semiconductors, right? So it's a very ambitious target which we are looking at. Forms a very important part of technology and also that of the indigenization of technological base, right? Now, let's first talk about what do we mean by semiconductors. See, semiconductors are a class of material which basically decide the flow of electricity in a particular environment, right? So the flow of the current, it is quite specific with respect to the semiconductors, right? So they have conductivity between conductors, for example, copper or aluminum, and insulator, for example, rubber, right? Now, how this conductivity is basically made, that how much amount of electricity is going to flow, that is basically dependent upon the kind of semiconductors we are going to manufacture. So semiconductors can primarily be categorized into 2 ways. Either it can be extrinsic or it can be intrinsic, right? Now, see, you must have heard about the N-type and the P-type semiconductors. What is a N-type semiconductor? Where the charge carriers, they have excess electrons in the n-type, what we call as n as negative, right? In the p-type semiconductors, you have excess of holes, excess of positive charge as the charge carrier, right? Now, this is basically made by a process which is known as doping. So you have a pure semiconductor in the form of silicon or germanium, and then you basically add some impurity, right? And that process is known as doping, right? And then we have the creation of n-type or p-type semiconductor. Their conductivity can be modified by doping. As I told you, it's a process of adding the impurities, right? So in a case of n-type semiconductor, we basically add the pentavalent impurity. And in the case of p-type, we add the trivalent impurity, right? Silicon, germanium, gallium arsenide. What are the uses of semiconductors? I have already told you that they have almost an omnipresent use in almost every sector, be it the manufacturing of the integrated circuits, microprocessors, memory devices, power electronics. So that is a basic definition of semiconductors. Now, what is the importance of semiconductors? When we talk about the digital economy, it forms the base, right? So as I told you in the beginning, that when we had this modern industrial progress, steel was the core material. Steel was the primary material for the economic progress. Now, when we talk about the digital economy, it is the semiconductor which forms the primary material for the industrial progress. It powers the computers, smartphones, telecom, you have the telecoms, you have the networking devices, you have the routers, right? Or let's say the medical devices, you have the CT scans, the MRIs, everything contains these semiconductors. Or let's talk about the modern artificial intelligence systems, right? Or let's talk about the supercomputers. Everything contains these semiconductors, including the defense platforms. Then they are a strategic resource. So as we had the oil in the 20th century as a strategic resource for the modern industrial progress, we have semiconductors as a strategic tool. See, those countries who have a base, a solid base with respect to the semiconductors, they are going to decide the process or the direction of the industrial progress. And therefore, it becomes indispensable for India to basically develop our own indigenous manufacturing and technological base with respect to semiconductors. And that's the reason you see that the government is giving all these incentives. Multiplier effect. What does it mean? See, it's not just about electronics. We're not just talking about the consumer electronics or the industrial electronics. What we are talking about, the whole ecosystem, right? So if we have a proper flow of these semiconductors, right? If there is a timely distribution of these semiconductors to various industries, or let's say if we have a strong innovation base with respect to the semiconductors, then it will not only help these selected industries. We're not just talking about the electronic manufacturing. Rather, it would have a positive spillover effect on the entire economy. That is what you have to understand. And that is what the aim of the government is also, right? That we have to basically make sure that we increase the level of the digital economy and we cross by a certain threshold, right? Catalyzes the growth in electronics, automotive, different sectors. For example, the renewable energy, or for example, the consumer electronics, right? So we have these LEDs, devices, commonly used electronic devices, or the high-end electronic devices. Everything contains these semiconductors. Then when we talk about the aspect of national security, see, for any country, what is really important is to have a very robust national security framework. And in the modern times, what is really needed is to have a strong base with respect to certain core elements of national security. What are they? For example, we have the cyber security, we have the surveillance aspect, we have the highly technological intensive defense platforms. So all these need adequate supply of the semiconductors, right? Critical for the defense systems, surveillance, cyber security. So that is what the importance of semiconductors is all about. Now, let's talk about the process of manufacturing, or what are the different stages involved with respect to the formation or the manufacturing of semiconductors. See, it's a highly technologically intensive industry. And that's the reason that it is concentrated in a few regions. It's not present, it's not diversified. Primarily, the reason is that there are multiple stages with respect to the manufacturing of the semiconductors, right? Now, when you talk in general, right? So you have the silica, which is actually then crystallized by melting into the silicon. So we have basically the formation of the ingots. What are these ingots? See, we have these basically the crystalline ingots which are basically manufactured of silica, right? Now, once you have these ingots, they are then basically sliced into different sheets, what we call as wafers, right? Once you have these wafers, we then start with a process known as photo lithography. Lithography. Now, what does it basically means? It basically implies that we are now having the circuit design made on these polished surface of these sheets, right? Once this photolithography is done, then you have the phase of etching, right? So you use basically a particular material and you remove the unwanted material. The process is etching. ETCHING, right? And then you have, after the etching, the process of layering and deposition. So you have multiple layers of semiconductors of these sheets, which are then joined to form a whole composite, right? And then after this process, you have the part of metallization, where you add certain very small, thin pieces of wires in these particular sheets. And then you have the phase of testing and then packaging. So just see that how many stages are involved in the creation of one single chip, right? So it's a very technologically intensive process. That's the reason only certain countries have expertise with respect to manufacturing of these semiconductors. Now, when we talk about the global semiconductor landscape, very, very important. As I told you, there is concentration of production. We have a very important company, which is Taiwan Semiconductors Manufacturing Corporation in Taiwan, which is basically producing, which has 60% of the global capacity of the foundries, right? When we talk about, it's one of the largest manufacturing base with respect to semiconductors. That is what you have to understand. Then we have South Korea, for example, companies like Samsung. We have the Hynix. Then we have the US. We have companies like Applied Materials. We have AMD, right? We have Nvidia, Qualcomm, all having expertise with respect to the various stages of the production of the semiconductors. Then we have Japan, specialized equipment materials, and then we have Netherlands. Now this is very, very important. There is a particular company in Netherlands which is ASML, right? Now I told you that we have this particular process of photolithography, where you are basically integrating or imprinting the circuit design on that particular sheet of the wafer. Now it is basically using a particular process which is electronic ultraviolet lithography. And this particular company, it virtually has the monopoly with respect to the electronic UV lithography all over the world. And it supplies the instruments which are required for that lithography process. I hope that is clear, right? Then we have China. China has basically invested a lot of money from the year 2014 till the year 2024. It invested almost $150 billion in the semiconductor manufacturing. But still, what you have to understand is, though it is one of the leading manufacturers and technological base of semiconductors, when we talk about the advanced technology, they are still with countries like Netherlands, Taiwan, or Japan, right? China still is working upon that particular area. And the semiconductor manufacturing forms a very integral component of Made in China 2025 vision of China. But for advanced lithography, it's still dependent on selected countries, as I've already told you, for example, Netherlands or Taiwan. Then we have the aspects of geopolitics. We already saw what happened after COVID-19 pandemic, right? So China basically stopped the supply of these critical minerals to US. And as a result, what you saw was the trade war. See, what you have to understand is that these semiconductors or the rare earth elements, they are the backbone of the modern industrial economy, right? And these countries, primarily US and China, they are using these commodities, these things as a kind of the strategic tool in order to manipulate, in order to force the other country to do as what they want. They are using these supplies of these semiconductors and critical elements or the rare earth elements as a tool of geopolitics. So that is the reason we had the war, the chip war between the US and the China. And that is why you must also know that the US passed a particular statutory law, the CHIPS Act of 2022, where US said that we are going to basically provide an incentive or the investments to the tune of almost $52 billion with respect to the domestic manufacturing capacity of the semiconductors, right? And it was also the reason, as a kind of a follow-up step, we had the European Union, which came up with its own EU CHIPS Act, which said that we are going to invest almost 43 billion euros in the capacity, in the development of the capacity for the semiconductor manufacturing. So that was a kind of a response mechanism because of the restricted supplies which China basically imposed on US and EU. Then we have the tensions with the Taiwan. So we have China and Taiwan tensions. And that is what something which basically restricts the supply of these critical semiconductors all over the world, right? So therefore, it gives a huge disruptions to the production capacity in different parts of the world. Now, let's talk about the India's semiconductor ecosystem. See, when we talk about the electronic consumption, we all know that we are basically witnessing a kind of a transition. We have witnessed a transition where we transition from the agrarian economy to a kind of a more services-led growth, where we are focusing upon these sectors, the services sectors. And therefore, one of the very important element of the services sector is the digital economy. And we have been focusing upon that. There is an upsurge. There has been a boom with respect to the usage of the electronic equipments, the consumer electronics, the industrial electronics. For example, let's talk about the smartphone users. So India has more than 65 crore smartphone users as of now. And the annual capacity, the annual turnover with respect to the electronics in the country, it has crossed 12 lakhs crores. 12 lakh crores of annual capacity of electronics manufacturing is taking place in the country. So this is definitely a bright spot for India. Now, what are these trends? Very, very important. See, when we talk about semiconductors, one thing is very important to understand. Semiconductor manufacturing, in the semiconductor manufacturing, we have one of the very important steps, and that is the design of the semiconductor. Now, when we talk about the design aspect, you must understand that India has a very good advantage. More than 20% of the world's semiconductor design engineers, they are of Indian origin. But the point is, design aspect of the semiconductor chain, supply chain, is one element of it. The other element and the more important is the fabrication plants, where we are still dependent upon the other countries. We are definitely trying to invest. What we have done, see, through the India Semiconductor Mission, we have basically approved 10 semiconductor fabrication facility in the country. And in Sanand in Gujarat, there is a kind of a joint venture between Vedanta and Foxconn, which is coming up. And we are also having a pilot production line in Sanand, right? So therefore, what Ashwani Vaishnav said, what the Union Minister for Electronics and Information Technology said, that we are coming up with our own indigenously manufactured semiconductor chips. And soon we'll be having a proper supply chain with respect to that, right? But fabrication plants are still something where we have to work upon. Then we have strong IT and startup ecosystems. Very, very important. The government, through various schemes, for example, we had the PLI scheme, we had the India Semiconductor Mission, as I told you, 76,000 crore incentives were provided. Then we had the design linked incentive. Now, over here, this is very, very important. See, what you have to understand is that we have certain important startups in the country, which are basically using the infrastructure being provided by the government and coming up with their own products, right? So you must know that there is a particular thing, a tool in the semiconductor supply chain, which is the EDA tool, which is the electronic design automation tool, EDA tool. Now, what happens with the EDA tool is that through the EDA tool, we have different startups, we have different engineers. They can basically design a particular semiconductor. They can basically verify it, and then it can be commercialized, right? So the design aspect is being very well served with the EDA aspect. Now, EDA tool is being provided by the government, right? More than 60,000 engineers, which from different startups or institutions, from 350 institutions around the country, they have utilized this particular government facility of the EDA, electronic design automation tools, to come up with their own designs. And this is again a very important step. And it is in that line that we have different startups, for example, Mindgrove. Now, Mindgrove is basically coming up with the IoT chips. You must know what is IoT, Internet of Things device, right? So IoT chips are being manufactured by this particular startup using the chips which are indigenously developed by IIT Madras, right? So this is a particular chip which has been developed by IIT Madras, which is known as the Shakti. Through the Shakti initiative, IIT Madras has come up with its own chip. And this particular chip is now being used by this particular startup to come up with the IoT chips. Then we have Netra Semi. Now, this is the very first startup in the country which has received a venture capital funding to the tune of almost 107 crores, right? And this is a very good thing, a very good news, because once these startups have their own funding, see, in a country like India, different startups are coming, and the founders of these startups, they basically believe in that frugal innovation, right? They don't have enough of funds. So whenever you have these startups getting this particular supply of funds, definitely it's a very good news, because then they'll be able to come up with their own innovation and with their own products more suited to the Indian economic condition. Then design houses of major global parts. So this is again very, very important. When we talk about different companies, let's say we have the Applied Materials, we have the AMD, we have the Merck, we have the companies like Lind, right? So all these companies, they have already started helping the Indian startups, right? So many of these companies, they have basically promised that they are going to basically invest a lot with respect to training the Indian engineers, right? So we have this particular company, for example, the Lam Research. Now, the Lam Research has promised that it is going to basically train more than 60,000 engineers in the semiconductor fabrication or technological advancement, right? Or we have the other companies like the AMD or the Applied Materials. They have promised that they're going to invest almost $1.1 billion with respect to the research and development of semiconductor facilities in the country, right? Next aspect is, what are the weaknesses? These were all the good points. Let's talk about the weaknesses. See, we may have a very strong base with respect to the design aspect. But when we talk about the fabrication facility, we are still dependent upon the other countries. In the year 2022-23, we basically spent $27 billion for importing these chips. Can you imagine? $27 billion. The global industry size is to the tune of $630 billion. And we are basically investing or basically spending $27 billion for the import of these chips. Why can't we have our own manufacturing base? Reason being that these fabrication plants, they're highly technologically intensive. Not just technologically intensive, rather capital intensive. One fabrication plant, if you want to basically set up a fabrication plant with end-to-end supply chain, it would cost to the tune of almost 10 to 20 US billion dollars. 10 to 20 US billion dollars. The plant which I talked about in Sanand, which is a joint venture of the Vedanta and Foxconn, it has been basically established by investment to the tune of almost 1.54 lakh crores. So this is a highly capital intensive aspect. That is what you have to understand. And therefore, we still do not have no large scale commercial fabrication operation as till date. We are having the pilot production lines, but they are only in that pilot phase. We don't have a fully operational supply chain or the fabrication facility, but definitely we'll have it in future. And high capital costs, I already told you, almost 10 to 20 billion US dollars are required for one particular fabrication facility. Then dependence on the imports. More than 90% of the demand in the country with respect to the semiconductors is being catered through the imports, right? So again, it's a sign, it's not a good sign. See, before a few days, we talked about the energy aspect. We are critically dependent on the crude oil or the supplies of the natural gas. Similarly, we are dependent with respect to the aspects of semiconductors. So therefore, when we talk about the energy aspect, we had a discussion with respect to the energy sovereignty aspect. Over here, what is really important is that we develop our own indigenous base. What have been the government initiatives? Let's talk about the India Semiconductor Mission. As I told you, the government promised that it's going to give incentives to various startups across the country to the tune of almost 76,000 Indian rupees, right? 76,000 crores. And then we'll focus upon the entire supply chain, not just on the design aspect, but rather the full fabrication facilities, right? Then we also are having the PLI scheme, right? Production linked incentive, which is for various sectors. For example, in pharmaceuticals. Also, we have it for electronics. Now, whenever we talk about the electronics, be it the refrigerator or the televisions or the other industrial equipments, all have this particular semiconductor component. So in a way, we are giving a boost to the semiconductor supplies. Then we have the design linked incentive scheme, focus upon the design aspect. Then we have the Semicon India Summit. Now, when we had the last summit, we saw the participation of just around 100 industry leaders. This time, we saw the participation to the tune of almost 500 industry leaders, global industry leaders. Now, this is a promising sign because now India can expect that we are going to have investments in this particular domain, right? And it is a part of a broader vision. Please understand that we have a target that we are going to basically make Indian digital economy cross $1 trillion, right? Very soon. So when we talk about the digital economy aspect, one of the very important core elements is the semiconductor manufacturing base, right? Then we have the robust digital public infrastructure. Very, very important. See, whenever we talk about the aspects of Aadhaar or India Stack or unified payment interface, definitely India has done wonders. Yes, I'm using the word wonders because it's not easy in a country like India where you have a lot of digital illiteracy, right? Coming up with these initiatives, even the countries like Germany or Singapore, They have sought inspiration with respect to the working of the UPI. Right, so it is definitely a very good sign. And why not create a base? We are already having a very sound base with respect to this particular infrastructure, what we call as digital public infrastructure, which comprises of India Stack, Aadhaar, UPI, and other things. So therefore, if we have this in particular dimension, we can also have in the other dimension when we talk about the hardware manufacturing, when we talk about having our own indigenous semiconductor manufacturing base. This is again give a boost to the other sectors, for example, artificial intelligence, or for example, the data processing centers. That is how you have to think. And again, we have the different policies. For example, the national policy on electronics, which tries to give a boost to the overall indigenous manufacturing of the electronics. Then we have a broader vision of Make in India, Digital India. All in one way or the other, they have this particular component of semiconductors. Now, what are the challenges for India? As I told you, high capital intensity. Every fabrication, if you want to basically set up a particular fabrication facility from end to end supply chain, this is going to cost more than 10 billion US dollars. 10 billion US dollars, right? And that too in a country like India, which has its own competing priorities, right? We cannot just, have this particular corpus. Government is doing its enough. But we cannot just expect that government, pumps in all the money to a particular sector, because we have our own socio-economic challenges, agriculture, poverty, right? So we have to focus on different sectors. Supply chain gaps. When we talk about the supply chain, right? See, as I told you, there are multiple stages which are involved in the production of the semiconductors. We may have expertise in the design aspect, but what about with respect to the wafer? Or what about with respect to the lithography? See, even countries like China, they're not able to compete with other countries. Even Netherlands has the edge, or it has a monopoly with respect to the lithography, which is used in the semiconductor. So we need to have our own robust supply chain. Every sector, every subsector has to be focused upon. Then skilled manpower shortage. This is something we have had. This problem we have had it's a legacy problem, legacy issue. Why? Because we have the engineers, passing from the great institutes, the very good institute of eminence, for example, Indian Institute of Science or the IITs. And then in most of the cases, what happens is there's a kind of a brain drain which we have witnessed. And see, again, it's not something for which we can blame those people. No, not at all. They are going over there because they have good incentives in the form of better research, in the form of better packages. So we have to create that ecosystem where people who are basically graduating from our colleges, they stay here in the country itself, and they contribute to the overall development in this particular sector, right? For that, what is really needed is good incentives to these people, right? Fabrication engineers or equipment specialists. We have to, focus upon this particular domain. We have to make sure that these scientists, they're retained in the country, provide them the incentives. Then global competition. India is definitely doing a lot, but what you have to understand is, in comparison to the countries like United States or European Union, or let's say we have China or Taiwan, they are having big pockets and they are investing billions of dollars in this particular domain. We really cannot compete with them. Therefore, we need to basically exploit or capitalize upon our advantages. They do not have the adequate number of human resource. There is a particular research which says that by the end of 2030, and see, the only reason which I'm giving you this data is so that you can use in your answers. Because see, it is not the data which makes your answer. It is the argument supported by a data which makes your answer, right? So there's a particular research which says that by the end of this particular decade, the world would require, or there would be a shortage to the tune of almost 1 million professionals with respect to the semiconductors. And India can definitely, supply this particular shortage, compensate for this particular shortage. That is what you have to understand. So we need to capitalize upon the area where we have the advantage. Energy and water needs, very, very important. A particular fabrication facility requires water, and that too ultra clean water. I'm talking about the ultra clean water, not even the kind of water which which the RO system dispenses, even more cleaner than that. It requires water to the tune of almost 10 to 15 million tons on a daily basis. That is almost equivalent to the kind of a need which a small city has. So from where you would supply the water, and that to ultra clean water? We are already having the shortages, drought-like conditions in several parts of the country, right? So that is again very important concern, and it requires uninterrupted electricity and millions of liters of ultra pure water. What are the opportunities? talent as I've already told you, there is a particular data that the world faces a shortage of almost 1 million semiconductor professionals by 2030. And India can definitely fill this particular gap, this particular vacuum, right? By training our own professionals, right? By coming up with our own new courses in various institutes. Then design leadership. Already we are having a leverage with respect to the design aspect. Why not become a leader? Right? Because see, if Netherlands can become a leader in the lithography aspect, if Taiwan can become a leader in the foundry aspects, why can't we become leader in the design aspects? Definitely we can. Growing domestic demands, be it electronic vehicles, be it artificial intelligence, the 5G and the prospective 6G, almost every sector, be it the defense platforms. Recently you must have heard about the Sudarshan Chakra, right? So every platform, every emerging technology, every innovative technology would require the semiconductor aspect. Semiconductor, the critical minerals, the rare earth elements. So definitely we'll have to invest in this particular aspect. And we are having an advantage, right? We are having advantage in the form of digital public infrastructure. So we have to give impetus to this. Geopolitical leverage. See, again understand. Though currently we are having strained relations with the US. But please understand, US has been a country which has by far been one of the most trusted partners. Let's not trust Mr. Trump. We're talking about the country. Two countries, two systems, India and the US, where we have received a lot of technological transfers from the US. And we have also come with a particular initiative, which is the ISET, Initiative on the Critical and Emerging Technologies, which has one of the very important element as the semiconductors. So leverage these partnerships. Japan has promised that it's going to basically invest in India 36,000 crores with respect to the semiconductor aspect, right? Diversification needed. See, the world is searching for diversification. You know, after the pandemic, and very important data, after the pandemic, there was a shortage of these semiconductors. And the global automotive industry, I'm again repeating, the global automotive industry, which is one of the very biggest users of semiconductors, it suffered loss, and I'm just talking about one particular year, to the tune of almost 210 US billion dollars in the year 2021. The global automotive industry. Why? Because of the shortages of the semiconductors. Reason that we had only certain concentrated pockets of these semiconductor facilities. So therefore, there's a call for diversification, not just by India, but for different countries around the world, right? That is what you have to understand. What should be the way forward? Very important. We have to focus upon a robust ecosystem, a strengthened ecosystem. Not just focusing upon one aspect. Definitely we can have a leadership in the design aspect, but the focus has to be on end-to-end supply chain. From the design to the fabrication, to the assembly, to the testing, to the packaging. And there's one very important aspect which I want to mention here. Before a country starts to have its own indigenous base with respect to the semiconductor manufacturing, it focuses upon ATMP, the assembly, testing, and the marking and the packaging aspect of the semiconductors. We have already developed skills with respect to the ATMP aspect. Now it is time that we should focus upon the end-to-end supply chain, right? Attract the foreign direct investments and technological partnerships, collaboration with different countries, be it the US, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, EU, all these countries. See, nothing, there's nothing like a free lunch, right? But definitely if India can give these countries, the design engineers or the professionals, definitely there can be a kind of a technological transfer. Invest in talent. There has to be the expansion of the semiconductor courses in various institutes, technological institutes in the country. Understand that there has to be a kind of a mental framework which focuses upon the lab to fab. That is, we need to come up with those subjects, those curriculums which focus upon these aspects in our technological institutes, right? So that we have the industry needed skills, right? Then the research focus, develop the indigenous chip architectures, which also includes the design part and also includes the fabrication, including various processes, be it the etching process, be it the lithography, be it the layering or the deposition, right? Then we have the energy and the infrastructure readiness. As I told you that these fabrication plants require a lot of energy, uninterrupted supply of electricity, and ultra clean pure water. So we need to first also invest upon these supporting infrastructure. We can go for a plug and play model, where the government basically gives the infrastructure a kind of a pre-ready infrastructure, right, for these setups. Then we have logistics cluster, be the highways, and see, these are the kind of the stuffs which are definitely needed, because in one way or the other, it catalyzes the overall production. Then balance mix policy. See, the government definitely needs to support. What happened in Taiwan? There, see, why Taiwan developed a very strong base with respect to semiconductors was primarily because of two reasons. There was a sustained support by the state, and then with the support of the state, there were also the partnerships between the private and the public sector. So we need to come up with those joint ventures. The government, we cannot expect the government to do everything. That is what you have to understand. Combine subsidies with long-term ecosystem building to avoid such subsidy-driven dependency. We cannot be for long dependent upon these subsidies. So that is what you have to understand. And this is a very good news. We have this particular chip developed by the IIT Madras, right? And this is what you have to understand. So what we're trying to say is, this is a sector which is going to drive the future economy, which is going to drive the strategic aspect. So we have to focus upon this particular sector. The government is already doing that, but also there are certain challenges which we'll have to look into, and then come with the needed interventions. And that is what you have to understand, so as to realize the vision of developed India by 2047. Let's have a mains practice question. Semiconductors are to the digital economy what steel was to the industrial economy. In this context, critically examine India's effort to build a robust semiconductor ecosystem. What opportunities and challenges lie ahead for India in becoming a global hub in the semiconductor value chain? Believe me, one of the very important and probable topics for the upcoming mains. Please write an answer to this. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button, and also let us know in the comments. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to India needs more women judges. When we look at the subject of the law or the domain of the law, what we see is that in the last few decades, definitely the participation of women has increased. But when we talk about one of the very important components, and that is the higher judiciary, still the participation of the women is quite abysmal. It's quite low. And this is obviously not a good sign for a country like India, which values gender inclusivity, right? It is in that context that we have this particular column featured in the Hindu, where the author says that as of now, when Supreme Court is working with its full capacity of 34 judges, we just have one woman judge, Justice B.V. Nagaratna. Now, obviously, this is something which is not good. So there is a need for increasing the participation of the women judges, especially in the context of higher judiciary, especially when we talk about the functioning of the Supreme Court. This forms a very, very important component of GS1, role of women, social empowerment, and GS2, judiciary. Now, when we look at the overall participation of the women, it's obviously not good, right? If you just look at this particular infographic, which has been given by the Vidhi Center for Legal Research. Now, the data is of 2019. This is what you have to understand. It says that when we talk about the lower courts, the subordinate judiciary, the participation of women is 27%. And then we talk about the high courts, the participation is 11%. Now, please understand, the data is from 2019. As of now, the recent data, it's almost 14.27% in the high courts, right? And it's almost 36% when we talk about the subordinate courts, 2024 data. And in the Supreme Court in 2019, it was 9%. And now this has reduced because just we have one woman judge in the Supreme Court. That is what you have to understand. Now, see, that is the aspect of the judges. But when we talk about the whole domain, right, including the women lawyers, what we'll see is that the participation is still low. So as a proportion of the total numbers of registered advocates in the country, women advocates account for only 15%. The total number of advocates, they're around 17 lakhs, just 15%. So as I told you, in the lower judiciary, their number is almost 36%. And in the higher judiciary, it's abysmally low. Now, see, in this particular article, it gives you very important data points. And here we'll also learn how to basically extract the information from the newspaper, right? So what it says is that Justice B.V. Nagaratna is the sole woman judge out of the full strength of 34 judges in the Supreme Court. Historically, only 11 women have been appointed to the court till date. Just 11. Can you imagine, right? Which is mere 3.8% of the 287 judges who have been appointed since its inception in 1950. Just 3.8% of judges, of the total number of judges, have been women. The last appointment of women to the court was on August 31st, 2021, when the collegium led by the Chief Justice N.V. Ramana appointed 3 women judges. And this was quite historical because you had appointment of 3 women judges at one point of time, right? Along with Justice Indira Banerjee, who was already on the bench, it was for the first time that there was more than 10% representation of women in the court, right? There also has been a total absence of the caste diversity. This is again one of the very important factors. We're not just talking about gender as a factor. We're also talking about the caste. That how many women judges from a SC category or the ST category have basically come and joined the courts. Their number is absolutely zero, right? Total absence of the caste diversity among the women judges in the court, as this has not led to the appointment of women from the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Justice Fatima Bibi remains the sole woman judge in the court from the minority community. Just only one woman judge from the minority community. There is a significant gender disparity in the number of the direct appointees to the court from the bar. See, we have for the subordinate judiciary, what you have to understand is that we have the state governments in consultation with the high courts. They basically conduct the examination for the appointment of the judges in the district judiciary, subordinate judiciary. But when we talk about the high courts and the Supreme Court, the process we have is collegium, right? So there is an element of discretion which is involved with the judges. Now, see, what you have to understand is that we also have one particular pathway, that is from bar to the bench. That we have these senior advocates who have had a sufficient tenure practicing in this particular field. So, sirs, in many times what we have seen is that the collegium system has also appointed people from the bars. But what the author is trying to say here is that the number of direct appointees to the court from the bar or lawyers directly elevated from the practice has been minuscule. From 1950, 9 male judges have been elevated to the court directly from the bar. Just 9 male judges. However, there has been only one woman till date, Justice Indu Malhotra. So, can you just imagine the condition? It's quite bad. Out of all the 11 women judges in the court till date, only 5 women have been a part of the Supreme Court Collegium, with only 3 having been involved in the appointments to the court. So, we're not just talking about their appointment in the higher judiciary. We're also talking about their participation in the collegium working. Collegium, which is the central figure with respect to the appointment, transfer of judges in the high courts or the Supreme Court. So, that is what you have to understand. Their participation is not just talking about their delivery of work or the kind of verdicts they declare or their participation on the bench. Here we are talking about their decision making with respect to being a part of the collegium system. That is also minuscule. The first woman Chief Justice of India will be Justice Nagaratna, who is scheduled to be appointed for just 36 days. That is what you have to understand. Now, what are the reasons behind the gender gap in the judiciary? Dr. Ambedkar, for many of the domains, he talked about one of the very important concepts. What he said was that when we talk about the mindset, there is a deep-rooted and systemic inequality within the mindsets. And that is one of the reasons which basically hinder the participation of women in every domain. Just before a few days, we had a discussion with respect to the STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics. The same applies with respect to the judicial aspect. That we have this particular ingrained patriarchal mindset. And that is basically something which is serving as a barrier for the women to participate in this particular domain, right? Also, we had Justice Hema Kohli, who said that, see, when we are sitting on the benches, we are delivering the verdicts. But when it is with respect to the administrative functions being carried out by the judges, women are sidelined. Women judges are sidelined. Why? Because there is a kind of an unconscious bias against these women judges with respect to fulfilling the administrative duties, right? Next, we have the hostile environment. See, in the courtrooms, what we have generally observed is, and it happens that there is a kind of a very argumentative environment which is there. And in such a scenario, what we generally see is that there is a kind of a suppression of the women voices. There's a kind of a hostile environment which is there. Many times we have seen cases of indirect harassment or even direct cases of harassment. This is what you have to understand. Then entry-level barriers. In many of the cases, there is a particular requirement that if a particular person has to be elevated to the higher judiciary, that person must have served a continuous period. That person must have practiced for a continuous period. Now, that is not possible when we talk about the women. See, women have their own priorities. They have their own familial obligations. And that is a kind of an period in their age when they have the other responsibilities, be it the childbearing, be it the other aspects. So they have to basically go make choices. And therefore, many times what happens is that they have to take the career breaks. And then if they do so, definitely they'll not be eligible for the further advancements. That is a kind of thing which has to be there, right? Disproportionate impact on their careers. So again, we should remove these, entry barriers. Next, we have absence of maternity benefits. See, in the legal profession, what you will see is that most of these lawyers, they're working independently. Now, whenever they have to fulfill their familial obligations, let's say childbearing or other things, they have to take a break. Now, in the other domains, what usually happens is that you get some form of benefit, social benefit, in the form of maternity benefit or a stipend, but we don't get the same in the legal profession. So that is one of the very important hindrances. Because if in the legal profession we would be having the stipend or the maternity benefit, that would give an incentive to that particular women lawyer, right? Incentive to just carry on her practice, balance her needs, balance her the needs with respect to her obligations towards the family and her also professional commitments, right? Lack of supporting infrastructure, very, very important. There is a particular data by Vidhi Center. It says that as of 2019, almost 100 district courts in the country had no separate toilets for the women. Can you imagine? No separate toilets for the women. And even in some of the high courts, see, we are not just talking about, let alone the lawyers, but in many of the high courts, what we have seen is that there are no separate toilets for even the judges. That is a condition, right? Basic amenities are absent, be it the toilets, be it the waste disposal facilities, the sanitary facilities, they are missing, completely missing. Absence of essentials. Let's say you have a particular woman lawyer with a very small child. There has to be child resting rooms, but those are not present. Let alone the child resting rooms. There are no toilets over there. Lack of family-friendly amenities, be it the feeding rooms or the creche. There's complete absence. And ultimately what happens is that the women lawyer has to basically take a decision that I'm not going to basically carry this particular practice. Rather, I'll focus upon my family. Then we have opaque collegium system. Very, very important. First of all, we have heard this so many times that the function of the collegium is absolute non-transparent, right? There's complete opacity which is there. Now, the collegium itself is not appointing the women judges. Has so far been, there have been minuscule appointment of the women judges. But when we're talking about the decision-making authority, the collegium, it does not have the adequate number of women judges in that. So that is one of the very important factors. Look at this. Manner of appointments is also a matter of the concern. According to the memorandum of procedure of the Supreme Court judges, the appointment of a judge of the court is decided by the Chief Justice of India in consultation with the collegium of the 4 senior most judges. After the receipt of the final recommendation, this is a process which is given, right? Next, it says there is no clarity as to on what basis the appointments will be made, as the criteria are not public. What are all the criteria which you are considering before appointing a particular person to the higher judiciary? Those criteria are still not clear. So definitely, you have in certain papers said that one of the important criteria would be the backward class, or let's say the religion. But what about gender? Are you incorporating the gender as a criteria or not? Absolutely not. At various times, the caste, religion or region of the candidates have been considered for the appointment. When caste, religion and regional representation are considered as a criteria for appointments, why is gender not institutionalized as a factor or as a particular benchmark to decide for the decision making? The collegium process is also shrouded in secrecy without any transparency as to who is being considered and when. There must be a commitment for diversity and inclusion of gender, caste, religion and regional representation, which has to be institutionalized in the form of a written policy in the higher judiciary so that the gender representation is mandatory. So you come up with a particular framework. Why not? Come up with, in the memorandum of procedure itself, agreed by the executive also, mention that these are going to be the parameters and gender has to be one of the very important parameters. Again, there is no women reservation when we talk about the higher judiciary. See, when we talk about the lower judiciary, in many of the states, they have a particular reservation which is there in the subordinate judiciary for the women judges. That is the reason what we see is that the participation of the women judges in the lower judiciary is much higher than that of the high courts and the Supreme Court. Now, here we talk about the funnel effect. If the participation of the women in the subordinate judiciary is low, you will have even lower number of judges in the higher judiciary, be it the high courts or the Supreme Court. That is a kind of a funnel effect, what we call. So the participation has to be enhanced in the subordinate judiciary so that we can have more number of judges. The talent pool has to be increased. so that we can have more number of women judges in the higher judiciary. What is the significance of higher representation of women in the judiciary? What is the importance? The very first is increased willingness of women to seek justice. Women have their own issues, and whether you agree or not, when let's say you have a particular litigant, a woman who is suffering, who has her own issues, if she will see more of women faces in the courts, she would be naturally inclined to basically go with her case. Let the court decide the case. But if she sees that there are more of male faces, she'll not be inclined. So the tendency to seek justice would increase. It would be made more inclusive if you have more women judges in the court. That is what you have to understand. Increased willingness of women to seek justice brings in alternative and inclusive perspectives. There have been many verdicts so far where the women judges have given much better verdicts than their male counterparts. Why? Because see, once you have women judges, they would bring their own viewpoints, and that would add to the deliberation. That would add to the quality of the debates, the quality of the arguments which we witness in the courtrooms. So definitely a very important point. Look at this particular point which the author says. Women judges bring unique perspectives to the court based on their personal and professional experiences with the law, which can have significant impact on the judicial outcomes. Use these points in your answers. It creates a greater public trust, more women seeking justice, or other genders also, right? And confidence, as it integrates varied social contexts and experiences that need to be valued. When we talk about that element of care, when we talk about that element of understanding, it is definitely more in the women's, right? So that is the reason. If we have more women in the courts, it can definitely lead to more people seeking justice, and it can make the whole court truly representative, and it would ultimately enrich the jurisprudence. The quality of the debates would improve, and this is very important, because once you will have more qualitative debates, you will have more quality verdicts. That is what you have to understand. What should be the way forward to bridge this gap? The very first is we need institutional, social and behavioral change. It's not just about constructing more toilets or more feeding rooms. It's also about that change in the social attitude. Behavioral change is needed. Those entrenched notions of patriarchy, they have to be rooted out. And we need to basically understand that, women judges have also contributed. Great. They have given verdicts far better than their male counterparts in certain cases. That is something which we'll have to focus upon. There has to be the focus. We need to basically give impetus to the inclusivity aspect. Gender diversity as a factor, in addition to the other factors, for example, region or religion or caste, have to be included. Collegium. It has to come with the clear guidelines and criteria with respect to the appointment of judges to the higher judiciary. Idea of reservation. Why can't we explore that? If we can have reservation in the subordinate judiciary, we can also go with that aspect of reservation in the higher judiciary. That is, we can implement this aspect of reservation, and we can have more number of judges in the higher judiciary. Supportive infrastructure and programs. See, we have these building committees. We have these building committees in different courts, right? Why not incorporate more women lawyers or women judges in these building committees so that we can have a more supportive infrastructure? For example, in the form of creche, or in the form of feeding rooms, or in the forms of toilets for the women, or let's say the sanitary facilities, right? Very important. And different policies. We need to come. Let's say every high court must come with its own policy, which is more gender inclusive in nature. Enhanced participation in the bars. Very important, because what we have seen is that bar is also one of the very important ways for the elevation to the higher judiciary. So there has to be more participation of women in the bars also. Advocacy and information, education and communication campaigns. This is something which even the former Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, emphasized, where he said that there is a need for regular conferences, seminars, so as to instill that particular mindset that we need to have more women judges. That is something which is really needed. See, when we are going to make the judiciary more inclusive, judiciary must have given so many verdicts saying that gender is very important, gender inclusive policy is very important, be it the Vishaka verdict or be it the Navtej Singh Johar verdict. But ultimately what matters is that if the Supreme Court is saying that, it itself should abide by its own values. It should itself become more gender inclusive. That is the need of the hour. Let's have a mains practice question. Despite constitutional guarantees of equality, women representation in the Indian judiciary remains disproportionately low. Analyze the key barriers to the gender diversity in the judiciary and suggest measures to ensure greater inclusion of women at all levels of the judicial system. We also have a previous year question which says, discuss the desirability of greater representation to women in the higher judiciary to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. So this is what you have to understand. Please try to write an answer on this. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do press the like button. Let's go to the next part. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about the devastating earthquake which has struck Afghanistan, which has led to the killing of more than 1,500 people. Now, in this particular article, the author is trying to give 3 reasons why we have seen such a massive devastation. The very first reason which the author gives is that Afghanistan is situated at a particular position, which is the intersection point of the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate. So it's a tectonically very active zone. And that's the reason we have frequently seen these cases of earthquake coming again and again. Next reason which the author is trying to give is with respect to the rough terrain in Afghanistan. So the terrain is very rough, and that is making the rehabilitation and the rescue efforts quite difficult. Third very important reason which the author is trying to give is that especially after the Taliban took over, we have had sanctions being imposed by various countries till this particular day. And that is making the rescue efforts, the mobilization of the financial resources very difficult. So there is a very serious lack of financial resources in Afghanistan. So again, understand, let's first talk about earthquake. See, earthquake is nothing but the sudden burst of energy within the earth, right? So we have fault zones. First of all, we have tectonic plates, right, which are in a constant motion against each other, right, at the boundaries. Or we have sometimes the fault zones. Whenever there is a burst of energy in the fault zone at these boundaries, what we call it, that there is a process of the earthquake, which results into the shaking of the earth, right? So we have this particular, let's say we have this particular point where the instance or where the point of the fault line takes place. That is what we call as the focus. The point exactly above the focus on the earth, it is known as the epicenter, right? And then there are certain waves which are, you must be aware of the P waves, the S waves, or the surface waves, which basically result into the devastation, the destruction. When we talk about earthquake, there are 2 very important ways to measure it. One is with respect to the magnitude of the earthquake, where we use the Richter scale. And the second is with respect to the intensity with respect to the destruction caused by the earthquake, where we use the Mercalli scale. Now, see, when we talk about the Richter scale, it's more objective in nature, right? And it gives us the defined number. For example, you can just see if the number is less than 2.5, the impact is not always felt. It can be, if it is from 5.5 to 6, slight damage. If it is from 7 to 7.9, major damage. If 8 plus, catastrophic. So it gives us a very objective picture. But when we talk about the Mercalli scale, which talks about the intensity, it is not, it's kind of a very subjective nature, that what has been the intensity of destruction. So you can also have a comparative reading with respect to this particular aspect of measurement, whether it is the magnitude aspect where we use the Richter scale or the intensity aspect where we use the Mercalli scale. Now, Afghanistan reeled on Monday in the wake of strong earthquake and multiple aftershocks, killing over 1,400 people. And by now, the number has crossed 1,500 and injuring at least 3,100. United States Geological Survey said that the primary tremor of the earthquake of magnitude 6.3 and had struck near Jalalabad. Another earthquake of magnitude 4.7 struck around 140 km from the epicenter of the initial tremor. So there were subsequent waves of these earthquakes. Rescue efforts are on to find the extricate survivors and locate bodies that are buried under the piles of the rubble. What makes the salvage operation, that is a rescue operation, particularly challenging are the limited resources available to the authorities, given that the ruling Taliban regime faces multiple sanctions, right? So many countries have till this day, they have not accepted, they have not agreed with the kind of the regime we are having in Afghanistan, Taliban regime. Withdrawal of this has been particularly stark following the withdrawal of US from Afghanistan in 2021. You can also see what has been the level of devastation, right? Let's go to the next part. Afghanistan, which abuts the Hindu Kush mountains and is at the juncture of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, lives under the constant threat of earthquake. Very, very important. Look at this. We have the Indian plate, right, which is forcing against the Eurasian plate, and we have the Eurasian plate. At the boundary, we have different blocks, right? And these blocks are prone to the earthquake, to that movement of the earth. We have the Kabul block, we have the central Afghan blocks, and we have these important regions, Pamirs or Karakoram or Kohistan, right? So therefore, this particular region becomes very vulnerable to the effects of the earthquake, right? And look at this, a particular snippet taken from the Al Jazeera. It gives us the instances which have happened in the past, be it that of 2023, be it that of 98, be it of 2002, the Hindu Kush 2015, the Hindu Kush again of 91. We have this particular case of 2025 and that of host of June 2022. Since 1900, 12 earthquakes with a magnitude of greater than 7 in the northeast Afghanistan have been reported. Can you imagine? More than 7, completely catastrophic in nature. In October 23, the western Herat province was devastated by an earthquake of magnitude 6.3, which killed more than 1,500 people and destroyed more than 63,000 homes. Given the vulnerability of the region, it also appears that the earthquakes of this magnitude and the epicenter depth cause much less damage to the lives and property in several parts of the world. Now, this is again important to understand. What the author is trying to say is, see, definitely the destruction has been massive. But we also have certain other areas in the world where similar earthquakes have been reported. Let's say some of lesser magnitude, but the destruction has not been there. And he is also referring to the aspects, the recent earthquake which we witnessed in Delhi. So what he is talking about, the earthquake resilient system or the earthquake resilient infrastructure. You must have seen that there are certain buildings. Then, just to make them more resilient, there is a kind of a retrofitting which takes place to make those buildings resistant to the effects of the earthquake. So that is very important component of the urban planning. That is what the author is trying to emphasize upon. And this is again Eurasian plate and the Indo-Australian plate. In February 25, we had a particular earthquake of magnitude 4, a relatively shallow and therefore potentially more devastating depth of 5 kilometers below. True, a quake of magnitude 6 is roughly 100 times more powerful than that of the one magnitude 4, assuming the depth of similar origin, but no physical damage at all was reported anywhere in Delhi. On the other hand, we also have the other examples. Chile is regularly besieged by quakes greater than that of the magnitude 6. All accounts suggesting minimal infrastructural damage and no attributable casualties. Primarily because the authorities over there, they pay good amount of attention to the urban systems, to the urban infrastructure systems, making sure that those systems are resilient. They are resistant to the effects of the earthquake. And this is how we do it. We have these buildings, the design of the building is made in such a manner that even if you have a particular earthquake coming, striking, then it would have a minimum damage to the building, right? So you can just also go through this. Earthquake resistant construction technologies. So one, we develop the seismic resistance. Second, we develop the vibration control. Third, we develop the base isolation. These are the three very important techniques with respect to the construction of the buildings. So we have to focus, a country's focus commitment to the enforcing building codes. We also have the national building code in the country. So that also incorporates this particular aspect of resilient infrastructure, which can bear the shocks of the earthquake. That is what you need to understand. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to sickle cell, the battle for disability justice. See, the gist of the article is that we have one particular statutory framework, which is rights of persons with disabilities, which tries to give a particular component, a reservation in the different services. Now, that is based upon the quantum of disability a person suffers from. Here in this particular article, what the author is trying to say is that when we talk about the sickle cell, it's a disease. First of all, it's a genetic disease and it's a quite painful disease. And it is particularly spread in the Adivasis and the tribal community. What the author is trying to say is that this particular benefit of reservation is not being given to the people who are suffering from this particular disease. Because the kind of certification which is required, it is based upon the discretion of the doctors and the medical boards, right? And that is something which is quite subjective in nature. So they are calling for the inclusion of this particular disease in that reservation benefit. That is, the people should be having, the people who have this particular disease should be given this particular benefit of the reservation. That is what the author is talking about. In March 2024, the Indian government issued revised guidelines under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, and these guidelines basically talked about that we need to have the assessment of the people who are suffering or having this 2 copies of sickle cell gene, sickle cell plus beta thalassemia or HPD combinations. What was the expectation of the people? That inclusion would provide the reservation in education, jobs, healthcare, and various government services. What is the reality? Sickle cell disease patients are recognized under the Act but excluded from the 4% reservation quota. Though they are recognized, but they are excluded from the quota. Sickle cell disease, nature and impact. It's a chronic, painful, and progressive blood disorder, disproportionately affecting the marginalized communities, especially when we talk about the Adivasis and the tribals. Symptoms: recurrent pain, anemia, organ damage, fatigue, physical hospitalization, reduce life expectancy. What are the social impact? See, if a person is suffering from such a disease, definitely the participation of the person with respect to the education or the other economic activities would be less, right? So it leads to school disruptions, poor job prospects, stigma, and discrimination in the society. There is a kind of a stereotype which develops against these people. We have this particular act, which is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, aims for dignity, equality, and non-discrimination, and to make the life for these people who are suffering with disabilities as more worthwhile, right? More dignified. Aligns with the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, defines the benchmark disability as 40% or more impairment. What is the problems? Many conditions don't meet the rigid 40% mark, right? See, it is not always about the quantitative aspects, it's also about the qualitative aspects. There cannot be the application of objective metrics in subjective domains. That is what you have to understand. Assessment depends upon the subjective medical judgment and it varies across hospitals and across doctors. Invisible or fluctuating disabilities like the sickle cell disease get excluded, undermining the right-based intent of the Act. Though the intent of the Act is very good to provide equality, dignity, but we are not able to fructify that because you are the kind of metric which you are using for this particular benefit, for the availment of the benefit, that is not correct. Certification challenges. Disability benefits, for example, pensions, or we have the income tax deductions, require officially disability certificate. That is really needed, a prerequisite. Certification process issues is based upon the medical scoring, that what is the kind of percentage of disability which is there, doesn't capture the invisible, episodic, or socio-economic impacts. What the ultimate result is that there are cases where the person who's actually suffering from a disease is not able to avail the benefits. Then there are issues of the accessibility. See, in this particular areas, there are no hospitals in place, there are no adequate facilities. So the certification process itself is something which is quite burdensome. Adivasi Dalits patients in the rural areas face a difficulty in reaching the district hospitals or getting required the lab test. That is not possible for them. Now, policy gaps and the needed reforms. Key gaps: exclusion from the job reservation, biomedical approach ignoring the lived experience of disability. You are basically having the certification approach, but this is not in line with the kind of the objective of the Act. That has to be changed. Inaccessible certification process for vulnerable groups, primarily the Adivasis or the tribals. What are the reforms? Extend the job reservation to these people suffering from the sickle cell disease and related blood disorders. Reform the certification to account for the fluctuating invisible disabilities. Adopts a right-based lens. That is very important. Do not have this particular metric where you are judging a person's sickness on the basis of that particular framework. Have a right-based framework. Disability is not just about physical impairment, but also about social exclusion and systemic barriers. These are also the factors which aggravate the aspects of exclusion in the society, right? Without the genuine projections and inclusion, recognition of sickle cell disease under the particular Act of Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act risks becoming an exclusion disguised as inclusion. So that is not something which is required. Please try to incorporate, make the framework, make the statutory framework, the whole policy framework more inclusive in nature. That is what the call of the article is. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the Supreme Court order on regulatory asset. Let's have the gist of the article. See, we have these power distribution companies, what we generally call as the DISCOMs. Now, these DISCOMs incur a particular cost with respect to the supply of electricity, what we call as the average cost of supply, ACS. Then we have the other aspect of the revenue which they get, what we call as the annual revenue requirement. Revenue in the form of the tariffs which they impose on the consumers and in the form of the subsidies they get. But in real picture, the scenario is that the average cost of supply for these DISCOMs is far greater than that of the annual revenue requirement. Therefore, they are having a kind of a loss. And what they do is that this gap, they term this as regulatory asset. What they say is that we are not going to increase the tariff as of now. But with time, in future, we'll increase the tariff and realize this particular gap between the average cost of supply and average annual revenue requirement. What the Supreme Court has said is that there cannot be unsustainable level of these regulatory assets. You cannot just say that, we are going to have it in future, realize in future. No, because that is going to impact the future generations. What the Supreme Court has said that we are going to basically impose this particular dimension, that you are going to have this particular regulatory asset maximum to the tune of 3% of the annual revenue requirement, not more than that. And if if you'll go with this particular policy or with this particular order, definitely there would be a requirement for the increase of tariffs. Now, this is a very politically sensitive topic. And that's why many of the governments, through the state electricity regulatory boards and the DISCOMs, they have made sure that they do not increase these power tariffs. Because if they do so, then this can definitely affect their political positions. That is what you have to understand. So, the Supreme Court has directed the state electricity regulatory commissions and the DISCOMs to clear the existing regulatory assets within 4 years. What all backlogs you have with respect to regulatory assets, that has to be cleared within a certain time period. And for that, if you will go with this particular approach, definitely there would be increase in the tariffs. Liquidate any new regulatory asset within 3 years. Cap or have this particular benchmark on the regulatory asset as 3% of the DISCOM's annual revenue requirement, not more than that. You cannot increase these regulatory assets more than 3% of the ARR. Ensure transparent recovery roadmaps and conduct intensive audits. Because see, again, understand, the reason why DISCOMs in India, they are not effective is primarily a political reason. Because there is political unwillingness which is there. They don't want to increase the tariff. Because if they'll do so, the voters would tell them or give the result in the next elections. So that is a very politically sensitive topic. What are regulatory assets? Regulatory assets are the deferred costs recorded by the DISCOMs when their average cost of supply is greater than that of average revenue requirements. For example, let's say for a per unit, let's say the cost of supplying is almost 7.2 rupees per unit. And the average annual requirement is the 7 rupees per unit. What is the gap of these 0.2 rupees per unit? And if total 10 billion units have been supplied by the DISCOM, then what would be the loss? It would be a loss of almost 2,000 crores for that particular DISCOM. Instead of raising the tariffs immediately, the SERCs allow this gap to be carried forward. Let the future generation decide. They will basically pay for it as a regulatory asset recoverable in the future. So this is a purely unsustainable strategy. That is what you have to understand. Why does the ACS and ARR gap arise? Non-cost reflective tariffs. Political reluctance to raise the tariffs, already told. Delayed subsidy payments by the state government. So, in many cases, what we have seen is that the promise which the state government makes, that you supply the electricity, we are going to compensate for it. That is not realized. The subsidies are not being disbursed on a timely basis because they also form a part of ARR, the annual revenue requirement. Then fuel cost hikes, raising the power purchases, right? Then we have case studies by Punjab, Delhi and Tamil Nadu, all highlighting that the levels of these particular deferred payments, they have gone to unsustainable levels. Impact on consumers, short term, we would feel it's fine. Let the tariffs be low, stable tariffs. But this is something which is unsustainable in nature. Long-term higher electricity bills when deferred costs are added. It's not just about the deferred cost, but also the interest which is being accumulated. So we have the interest plus the deferred cost. Example in Delhi, to recover the regulatory assets within 4 years, additional 5.5 rupees per unit burden would be there on the consumers. Do you think this would happen? Obviously not, right? Let's see what happens. But looking at the practicality of the politics, I don't think this would happen. Impact on the DISCOMs, severe cash flow pressures, inability to pay the power generators on time. So DISCOMs are just the distribution companies. Ultimately, they also have to pay back to the generators. But if they don't have adequate supply of money, how would they be able to pay the generators? That is one of the very important questions. Increase borrowing and debt burden. And they have limited ability. See, if you have less of funds, you'll not be able to modernize, right? Modernize the grids, integrate renewable energy, improve the consumer services. So there has to be a very realistic tariff approach where you impose those tariffs which are really needed, right? We cannot have this political aspect in this particular aspect. Creates a vicious cycle or financial distress and the operational inefficiency. Because if you have lesser funds, you'll not be able to modernize. You have these visions of integrating the renewable energy. How would you do so? That is not possible. Bridging the ACS and ARR gap, what should be the way forward? Cost reflective tariffs with targeted subsidies for vulnerable consumers. See, if you think that there are certain consumers who need the state support, give them the support, but that should be targeted, not for everyone, right? Timely release of the subsidies by the state, automatic fuel cost adjustment mechanism. If the fuels which are being used for the generation of the powers, if they are getting costly, definitely the power should also, that increase in the cost should be reflected in the kind of tariffs which are being imposed by the distribution companies. Regular annual true-up exercise, that is, there has to be very clear and defined audit which has to take place, right? Because many a times these things, they're just buried into the files. Nobody takes a note of them. So there has to be regular audit of these discoms. Regulatory discipline by the state electricity regulatory commissions, enforce limit on the regulatory assets, ensure transparent accounting, and maintain strict recovery timelines. Very, very important, right? So this is what you have to understand. This is definitely a very practical order which has been given by Supreme Court, but the chances of its, implementation, they are quite bleak. Reason being, if the tariffs are going to increase, that is going to affect the consumers, and this is a very politically sensitive topic. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to one of the very important reports published by the World Health Organization, which talks about one of the very important aspects of the overall health, and that is the mental health. See, in the kind of world we are living, we are having a lot of stress, and that is basically compromising the overall health of the humans. And therefore, mental health is also something where we have to focus upon, right? So 1 in every 100 deaths globally is a case of suicide, according to the World Health Organization. According to the findings, an estimated 727,000 people across all ages lost their lives due to suicide in 2021. Can you imagine? 727,000 just because of suicide. This is again a very serious concern. One death happening in over 20 suicide attempts. The WHO further says that more than 1 billion people are living with mental health conditions. So we have, in fact, a lot of people who are suffering from these issues, but they're not able to say, because that is a kind of the stereotype which has been developed in the society. If you have a particular person who is suffering from anxiety or depression, we tend to stereotype. We tend to have the negative, biases against that particular person. We try to avoid that particular person instead of including that person in the society or hearing that particular person. We basically follow the opposite approach. And what ultimately happens is, in many of the cases, this particular anxiety or depression, it converts to that extreme feeling, and the person is compelled to basically go for this particular suicide. So again, a very serious issue. The World Mental Health Today and Mental Health Atlas 2024, the most common mental disorders are anxiety and depressive disorders, which together accounted for more than 2/3 of the mental health conditions. More than 65% are these two things, the anxiety and depression. The global age standardized point prevalence of mental health disorders reached 13.6%, and it has increased in comparison to that of a decade ago. Anxiety disorders typically emerge earlier than depressive disorders, which are rare before 10 years of age. After the age of 40 years, depressive disorders become more prevalent than the anxiety disorders, peaking between 50 and 69 years. So initially what it has been observed is, we have the anxiety disorders, and slowly they take the form of depressive disorders. Again, a very serious concern. Suicide is the leading cause of death among the young people across all countries and socio-economic contexts. See, if you have these young people, and in a way, if they're being forced to commit suicide, maybe because of mental disorders, whatever, that is something which is a very serious concern, because ultimately the society is responsible for that, not those people, because we fail to provide those conditions, those good ameliorative conditions to those people once they were suffering from the anxiety or other disorders. So what is really needed is a more inclusive framework, right? And see, this is again a very important thing to be discussed. Most of us are preparing for the UPSC. You all are preparing for the UPSC, and many times there is a kind of anxiety and disorder. So whenever you come across any person who is basically having this particular feeling, is going into that mode of depression, tell that life is much bigger than that. Becoming an IAS officer or IPS officer, it is a means, it's not an end. So life is much bigger than that. Please try to focus upon that. There is an interaction of personal, familiar risk, vulnerable temperament, and environmental risk such as early exposure to trauma, stressful environment, life. We have so much pressure, there's peer pressure, there's expectation from the society, right? So these are something. See, again, whatever you do in life, you just give your best efforts and let the Almighty decide what's the result is going to be. We cannot decide everything. We just control the controllables. That is what is needed, right? Sigma, poor awareness of the help, lack of availability, and access to service. A combination of factors increases this particular risk. There's a need to have psychiatric beds in the general hospitals and tertiary care institutions. We are not focusing upon this particular aspect of psychiatry. So that has to be focused upon because mental health is one of the very important components of the overall health. While acute cases can still be treated at mental health institutions, the model of care must shift from custodial to therapeutic approaches. If you have people suffering from any kind of anxiety or hyperactivity disorder or depressive disorder, we need to have solutions for them. We need to have a kind of a medical setup which also looks into that particular aspect, and also the societal setup. Psychiatric hospitals are often associated with poor living conditions and ill treatment. This is because of the second challenge, that is scant funding. Funding is not there, right? And again, for a country like India, we have our competing priorities, right? So again, we need to have more funding. That is something which is really needed. The third challenge is the scarcity of trained mental health personnel, the doctors, right? The number of psychiatrists in the interior parts of the country is abysmal. So we need to have more number of healthcare workers in this particular domain of mental health aspect. Very important topic. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the last topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to a very important body, which is the Central Water Commission. So the Central Water Commission has come up with a particular report and says that the glacial lake area in the country, in India, has grown over by 30% since 2011. Now this is very important. Just before a few days, we had a discussion with respect to glacial lake outburst floods, GLOF events. So many of these GLOF events have taken place in the Himalayan part, and this has led to a lot of devastation, crumbling of the infrastructure, loss of life and property. So this particular data is very, very important. What information it gives us is that it is the Central Water Commission which is responsible for coming up with these research activities, coming up with these data intensive exercises to know which parts of the country have how much of these glacial lakes, rising from 1917 hectares to 2508 hectares. The findings come in the backdrop of widespread flooding across the country. Central Water Commission, a premier technical organization under the Department of Water Resources, River Development and Ganga Rejuvenation, part of Ministry of Jal Shakti. Very, very important. Please understand. Central Water Commission is a premier technical organization of India in the fields of water resources and presently functioning as an attached office. Very, very important. There can be a statement in the prelims saying that CWC is basically a subordinate office. No, a subordinate office has lesser power. It has to do what the ministry says. But when we talk about the attached office, it has a relative autonomy which is exercised by this particular body. Under the Ministry of Jal Shakti, Department of Water Resources, River Development and Ganga Rejuvenation, the Commission is entrusted with the general responsibilities of initiating, coordinating and furthering in consultation with the various state governments concerned schemes for control, conservation, utilization of water resources throughout the country for the purpose of flood control, irrigation, navigation, drinking water supply and water power development. So the domain is quite broad in nature, but what you have to understand is that it's a premier technical organization. Very important body, and a probable question in the prelims can definitely be there. So here we come at the end of the discussion. I hope the discussion was really fruitful for you. All the very best. Thank you so much.